There's much to talk about, so let's get to our panel. Joining us from London is Mohsen Milani. He is the Executive Director of the Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies at the University of South Florida. With us here in Washington is Ahmad Majidyar. He is the Fellow at the Middle East Institute and the Director of the IranObserved Project. And joining us from Shanghai is University of Tehran professor and political commentator Mohammad Marandi. Mohammad Marandi, let's start with you in Shanghai. A really exciting election in Iran, and Hassan Rouhani winning, but really quite surprising in terms of his margin. What does this mean going forward for Iranian politics and beyond?
Well, I don't think it was very surprising. The polls indicated from well before the election that he was significantly ahead of his rivals. As in previous cases, the incumbent has always won the re-election. I think that in general, the major issue for Iranians was the economy, according to polls. And despite the fact that the economy hasn't been performing well, I think Iranians believe that since President Rouhani has been working for 4 years, they should give him a second chance to improve the situation. Also, I think that the majority of Iranians felt that the foreign minister, Dr. Zarif, was an asset to President Rouhani, and I think that also contributed to his victory.
Mr. Milani, in London, the margin of the victory was quite wide. What did it for Rouhani? Because his campaign seemed to get more and more reformist, a lot of commentators say, up to polling day. Is that what brought people out, or is it a bit more complicated than that?
I think there were two major factors. One was that his major rival, Mr. Raisi, was a relative unknown, an obscure figure, until about 3 or 4 months ago. But more important than that, the message Mr. Rouhani had was a message that resonated with the youth of the country, which constitute about 60% of the population, with urban middle class. And that is why he was talking about reintegration of Iran into the world economy. He was talking about reconciliation with the world, with Iran's neighbor, and with the rest of the world. And most importantly, he was sending a message that he wants to make the Iranian state less intrusive into people's daily lives. The combination of the three very popular messages made it possible for him to win in a landslide. It is, in my judgment, a victory for the forces of moderation and reform in Iran.
Ahmad, what does this mean for Iranian politics going forward? Because also, one always looks also at the supreme leader in Iran, and there's always talk of succession, and because we have now a more reformist president, what's the implications there?
Well, the election itself was a referendum on President Rouhani's message of reforms at home and also engagement with the West. And definitely a majority of Iranians accepted that versus Rouhani's rival, conservative rival, who was advocating for looking inwards to address Iran's economic problems. But the key question right now is that how much Rouhani can deliver. Because during the last days of the campaign, he touched on some red lines of the regime. He talked about writing the name of Israel on the missiles that Iran is producing. He criticized the powerful Revolutionary Guards. He talked about the judiciary in Iran, which is repressing the Iranians. So definitely we will see a backlash from those powerful institutions which will block any gradual reforms that President Rouhani is intending to carry out. And as you mentioned, there is a succession issue in Iran as well. The supreme leader is 78 years old, and reportedly his health is deteriorating. So if there is a succession, there will be efforts by the Revolutionary Guards to just bring their own person to just succeed him. So definitely we'll see a lot of resistance to any reform agenda that President Rouhani will have.
Mohammad Marandi, do you agree with that? And what do you think the biggest obstacle is for Hassan Rouhani in the next 4 years? Is it the economy, which, even though there's been sanctions relief, hasn't shown much growth outside the oil sector? Or is it all the complications that Ahmad was just talking about?
Well, I think there are a number of things that we have to keep in mind. One is that President Rouhani has not crossed any red lines during campaigning, and I think that's an inaccurate assessment. What he was talking about with regards to the missiles, in fact, he discussed today in his statements with the press today, and he said that Iran's missile defense is something that's necessary and something that must be kept. What I think is mostly important right now for the next 4 years is definitely the economy. President Rouhani obviously has his opponents, and his opponents will continue to oppose him, and that's, of course, one of the realities of Iranian politics. In the West, when you have different political parties, they don't call it a power struggle. They call it different institutions and democracy at play.
Checks and balances.
When it's Iran, in the West, they call it a struggle for power and the regime and so on and so forth. It's not checks and balances when it comes to Iran.
Yes.
So I think we have to acknowledge that Iran has really scored a major achievement over the past few decades after the revolution, despite the fact that it's in a very unstable region, despite the fact that it has foreign antagonists, despite the fact that none of the countries in this region are democratic, and Western countries are increasingly losing their democratic values, according to many analysts. I think the fact that Iran continues to have these elections and that there are such high turnouts on every occasion, I think that's a major achievement. I think, though, for most Iranians, the most important thing in the coming years is jobs, as well as the economy. Other issues are also important, as I pointed out, but I think that is at the top of the list.